I want to just think about the socially dynamic organisation. We're going to take a break in a minute and then we'll talk about this. I believe that we need to do two things. We need to develop social leadership capability alongside the formal leadership capability that we have. We need both. This is not a replacement for formal leadership. And we need to build a socially dynamic organisation. And what is a socially dynamic organisation? It's guided, not governed. I probably put the most important words right at the bottom here, so you definitely can't read them at the back. It's guided, not governed. If we rely on formal hierarchy, system and process for our strength, we're in trouble. What we need are lightweight. We still need them in some places, don't get me wrong. We absolutely need all the great aspects of our formal strength. But we need to have also the great aspects of social strength, which are enabled and empowered by connective technology. We need to be guided, not governed. We need to be unified in values, which is why we are half of the solution. We have to find our shared values and we have to find ways to dissent, but find ways to dissent together, to engage in the challenging conversations within our communities. We need divergent thought. We don't just need conformity and compliance, although we do need conformity and compliance. We also need divergence. We need to be permeable to expertise, reconfigurable to needs, the very thing that formal systems are typically very bad at doing. Yeah, this is the grounded bit. You know, aspiration, we all want it to be better. Organisations want to be better. But culture's an interesting thing. Culture, I would argue, it might be interesting actually, Cormac and I may have the same or different view on this or nuanced views on it. I argue that aspirational culture is what the organisation owns. It's a fiction that's held in documentation and printed on posters that go in lifts. Lived culture is co-created in the moment by every individual. The grinding reality of everyday culture is what we experience and where we operate. Aspiration is usually ground into dust by the reality of culture. Social leadership is a development framework. So at a practical level, you know, it's nice to talk about stuff, but I like to get down to how do we actually do it. This is a framework that I've now used prototyped across a range of organisations over a couple of years. So this is the best I've got to a sort of understanding of how do we develop social leadership. I say I will give you a copy of this, so I'm not going to spend long on it now. But broadly speaking, within the system, within the spaces we're in, we need to choose our space. It starts here. We curate a space. What will we be known for? How will we find our power to affect change in social spaces? We need to be, much like President Trump, expert storytellers. We need to learn how to tell stories in different ways. We're probably good at telling formal stories in formal systems, but the social structure doesn't work like that. It works on social stories, on interesting stories that flit through the system. So we need to become expert storytellers and start to share, not just widely, but wisely, interpreting our stories to be relevant to groups, co-creating stories, building a legacy out of storytelling. We need to understand the different communities that we're in, the formal through to the informal, the sanctioned through to the subversive, and to understand the broad range of roles that we take in each of those spaces. In some of those communities we will lead, we will represent formal power, we'll represent formal knowledge. In some, we will be learning. Sometimes we'll be linking people between communities. Sometimes we'll be challenging, nurturing, developing. We take many different roles. This is the interesting piece. If we act in our communities, if we add value to our communities, if we help others to succeed and do so with a willingness to engage and with a humility, we will earn a reputation, and we'll earn it. We can't buy it or demand it. We will earn the reputation in our communities, and from our social reputation in our social communities comes our social authority. Social authority is at the heart of social leadership. If the community gives you power, you have power, not given by the organisation. Formal power sits in formal systems. Social leadership sits in social systems, and we need both, and we need to develop it in others. Social capital is about this ability to survive and thrive in this space. So we need high social capital, and we need to develop it in others. So anyway, I'm going to continue at 100 miles an hour because I want to get into this piece about how organisations change. This is a large body of work I'm publishing in the summer about change. How do some organisations successfully change? Some fail to change, and some get stuck somewhere in the middle. I'll talk you through it, and let's just sort of think about how it applies to us. There's a process from intent to transformation. You know, an organisation, I'm using organisation as a kind of catch-all phrase. I know the NHS is a complex multi-organisation structure, but we want to change. There's some kind of provocation to change. It might be internal, it might be imposed from outside, but we know we need to change. We then either end up transformed or falling back into the current state, and I'm looking at three manifestations of change. Resistant organisations deploy antibodies. They feel the disturbance, they sense that something is changing, and they deploy all these antibodies to kill the change conversation off. They silence it, they starve it of resource, they say it's not in your remit, they say this is just an aberration, everything will settle down. You know, resistant organisations, there aren't actually that many of them, but there are many organisations that have pockets of resistance, aspects that don't want to change, often deeply embedded. The trouble with resistance and antibodies is it leads to this kind of churning effect where they just never get off the starting line. Constraint is interesting. Constrained organisations are good organisations full of people who are almost as bright and beautiful as we are. They're good organisations that want to change. They're investing significant amounts of money and effort in change. They're kicking off multiple projects. They're bringing in the very best people. And 2 years later, they're still bright organisations that want to change. Some of those projects have run their course. Some have delivered. Some have failed. Some of the good people have left. Other good people have come in. They're still spending a lot of money. And fundamentally, they're not changing. Most organisations fall into that space. They are constrained. Well-meaning, well-intentioned, functioning today, but deeply in trouble if they're unable to change. There are all sorts of aspects of resistance. The control of technology, who holds the strings for investment, where capability lies, what permission there is. I won't go deep into this work because it's a big piece, but understanding how static communication systems are, who owns storytelling, how authentic stories are. Aspects of thought, habit, sense of belonging, strength of community, these all tie into it. And straight behavioural pieces, mechanisms of reward, elasticity of behaviour. There's all sorts of aspects of resistance. The dynamic organisation is interesting because it's fundamentally based on a different type of strength. I would argue that in a time of constant and accelerating change, we don't need an organisation that is simply able to change faster. We need an organisation that is fundamentally adapted to hold within its DNA, its core strength, an ability to just reconfigure to need. It's a fundamentally different type of organisation. Most of the organisations we have today are a legacy of kind of Roman through feudal to Victorian mechanisms of power and control that took individual utility, that thing that I can do myself, and functional utility and economic utility, which is the money that can be earned off the back of it. As an individual, historically, I had limited economic utility. And organisations sort of aggregated and leveraged functional utility at scale to achieve wide effects. But in doing so, they concentrated wealth and power at the top of the triangle. Today, the democratising effects of technology are changing that balance. People are increasingly able to hold both their functional and economic utility directly or in loosely connected communities that sit outside a formal structure. We need to have something of that ability. An ability to recognise the formal strength of the organisation and that social strength of the organisation. Because in a socially dynamic organisation where there's disturbance, there'll be a community that's deeply engaged in that change, able to figure out what to do about it in breadth and at scale, to co-create the future state and to achieve momentum. And momentum is the key thing in change. How do we achieve momentum? I presented some of this work at BAE when I was last up in Preston, interestingly, and I had the usual conversation about change, talking through what it is, and someone stood up and said to me, well, what you have to understand is that, we're like an oil tanker and, we're steaming along, and you throw the wheel and throw the engines in reverse and everything judders, and 8 miles later it starts to turn a bit. And, it's very interesting, it's very true, and it's largely a load of old nonsense, because I said to them, you built the oil tanker, nobody put you on it. We've engineered the resistance in our systems. There are very few hard constraints on our capability. Many of the constraints we have engineered in. And that's why older organisations that were resistant can work hard and get to simply being constrained. But young organisations that tend to start inherently dynamic typically fall to constraint, because it's in the nature of people and systems to accrete system and process and mechanisms of control which fall into constraint. So what's the NHS? Is it resistant, is it constrained, or is it dynamic?